The Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
Good morning, and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am Arch Hunter, the host of the program. Our American Heritage is a program where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning to the present. And today we want to welcome back as our guest, Judge Lacey. So, Judge, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you, Arch. Good to be back.
It's wonderful to have you with us. And listeners, the judge did a program many months ago on General Joshua Chamberlain, and we wanted him to come back and speak on President General Ulysses S. Grant. But before we do that, Judge, would you share with our listeners a little bit of your background, and we'll get right into the topic that you would like to discuss with us today?
Okay, very good. I went to Michigan State University, went on to Villanova Law School. I graduated from there in 1975, and 16 months later, I was appointed by Governor Milton Schaap as District Justice for the boroughs of Darby and Colwyn. And I sat there for 31 years, retired, and then came back as a senior judge, filling in where there are vacancies. Apologize, my voice is a little raspy today.
That's perfectly fine. What is your interest in American history? I have some curiosity questions for you. Were you always interested in American history, or something that you acquired over a period of time?
I can actually date it back to when I was 11 years old. That was the centennial of the Civil War. And the Philadelphia Evening and Sunday Bulletin had an insert on the Civil War, and I sat down and I read that, and the bug bit me. And then it was not just the Civil War, it was military history. And then as I got older, it was Greek and Jewish history. So I've been up to my ears in history most of my life.
And is there a specific time period or a specific part of history that you have a fondness for more than others?
Oh, absolutely. It's always been the Civil War.
Okay.
It's unique, I think, in all of human experience. The Civil War was almost, well, in many cases, literally brother against brother.
Mm-hmm.
And I struggle with some of the revisionists now, but it was a time of great upheaval, a time of pain, but a time of greatness. And many people rose to the occasion and gave us the country that we have today.
Judge, I did a tour of Gettysburg last week for a group, and one of my favorite judges was with us on that tour, and he is a friend of yours, and he is a relative of mine. And once again, he speaks very, very highly of you. So,
well, you can't trust everything that Lee says.
Particularly, Judge, on the golf course when he gives you his score for the card. Yes. He believes in revisionist math, Judge, on the golf course. So
but we'll just keep that between us and everybody.
We will. We absolutely. You want to talk to us today about President General Ulysses S. Grant, and particularly the last year of his life. And my question to you is, what was your motivation for wanting to look at and study, particularly Grant's last year of his life?
Well, kind of ironic. My wife and I, before the COVID lockdown occurred, went down to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and we were in the gift shop at the Fredericksburg battlefield, and I saw this book, and it caught my attention. And first of all, it was kind of out of place at Fredericksburg, but it was a book called Grant's Last Battle, and it appealed to me. Very short book, written by a young man by the name of Chris Makowski, and it documents that last year of Grant's life. And I was hooked immediately. The more I read, the more I wanted to read. I went and got Ron Chernow's book. And then there's another wonderful book by Mark Perry called Grant and Twain. And I devoured those. And of course, we were all on lockdown. So it gave me something to do rather than just stare at the walls and curse fate.
And was that the first time you were at Fredericksburg, or have you visited there often?
Oh, I've been there a few times.
Okay.
But we were there for other purposes that time. My wife had never seen Maurice Heights.
Mm-hmm.
So we went there. And of course, if you've been to Fredericksburg, there's no way today that you can see what Maurice Heights was
yes.
back in 1862. But We then started to look at early colonial properties in the area. Stratford Hall, which was Lee's birthplace, and a couple of other places that were relevant to the American Revolution and then also to parts of the Civil War.
And it just so happens that 3 weeks ago, I was in Fredericksburg myself leading another tour. And it's a sobering place when you realize what happened at Fredericksburg. And so
it really is.
Yeah. So talk to us, please, about General Grant's the last year of his life and what transpired and why, the reason that that's so overlooked with the career and the presidency of General Grant.
Well, it's, I think, probably the greatest act of heroism that Grant committed. He finishes his term as president. He and his wife, Julia, go on a round-the-world tour, 2.5 years. And he comes back, and people don't realize that in the 1800s, the president had no pension. That was problem number one. Problem number two is that in order to run for president, he had to resign his commission as general. So he had no military pension either. And now he's looking for something to do and somewhere to live. And fortunately, a group of financiers got together and they raised funds for him. Matter of fact, they raised $250,000. And the idea was that he would live on the interest, which was calculated about $15,000. And he and Julia would live on that. And the next thing he does is he looks for a house. And I guess, I hate to say this, but Julia was, I think, the quintessential Southern belle. She was so wrapped up in those things material. And I think Grant really spent a lot of time catering to her. So he finds a house on East 66th Street, Manhattan. And I think the story of Grant's last year, if I might digress for a second, is a story of who's who of the 1880s. He had made some very, very wealthy and powerful friends. And as he's looking for the house, Anthony Drexel and George Childs decide they are going to help fund the purchase of the house. Now, Anthony Drexel was a multi-millionaire. George Childs was a newspaperman. He had founded the Philadelphia Ledger, which has become the Inquirer. And Childs and Drexel put up $100,000 for the house, which ironically cost $98,000. Of course, Julia was unhappy because she couldn't furnish it in the way she wanted to furnish it, because there was only $2,000 left over from the purchase price. But he moves in there, and the issue now is, how do I make a living? Well, he had 3 sons, none of whom became politicians, but his one son, Buck, who was Ulysses Jr., had gotten involved in finance. And as he was doing that, he meets a man by the name of Ferdinand Ward. And Ferdinand Ward was known as the young Napoleon of Wall Street. And Ward was making people extremely wealthy. So Buck talks to Dad and says, this is the guy. We should take whatever money we have and invest it in Ferdy's business. So Grant bites on it. And of course, the history of Ulysses Simpson Grant is the story of a man who trusted too well. And he saw what he thought was financial stability in investing with Ward. Ward had a partner by the name of James Fish, and Fish was the president of the Marine Bank in New York. And as I said, people were making lots and lots of money investing with Ward. Sometimes 20, 30% a month on their investments.
Wow.
So Grant saw this as financial independence. Let's invest what we have. We'll get involved with Mr. Ward and not so much with Mr. Fish. He was kind of the silent partner. And Ward brings Grant in, initially as a limited partner, then down through time as a full partner. And the name of the firm is changed to Grant and Ward. Well, what nobody realized was that Ferdinand Ward was running a Ponzi scheme.
Oh.
He was taking the investments that other people were investing and paying off his earlier investors. He then had the good fortune of being a full partner with the hero of the Civil War, General Grant, and a former two-term president. Now it's his ability to imply that he has access to government contracts, that he can do all kinds of things that other financial managers can't do because of his relationship with General Grant. So people flock to it. Grant's own family gets involved. Buck has $400,000. Fred, his other son, invested an enormous amount of money on the strength of Ward's performance or supposed performance, and of course, Grant's overwhelming honesty. Well, as time went on, first of all, Grant invests $50,000 that he really didn't have, but he invested $50,000 into Grant and Ward. And what he didn't realize was that Ward was giving assets a group of worthless securities. There was no money. It was an empty shell, Grant and Ward.
Huh.
And his only working capital was coming from the Grant family.
Wow.
And eventually, Fred invested $1.5 million in 1880s money.
Wow.
And of course, Grant, as he had done so many times in his life, just blindly trusted Ferdinand Ward. Of course, he should have gotten some kind of whiff of a problem when he found out that only Ferdinand Ward could conduct the business of the firm. Grant had an office. He would go there every day. Ward would make sure he had 21 cigars. And Grant would sit there and Ward would put paper in front of him and Grant would sign it, having no idea what it was he was doing, but going totally on his trust of Ferdy Ward. Well, one day things start to fall apart, as all Ponzi schemes do. You can't always find enough investors to pay off your earlier investors. And that's where Ward found himself. And he has a meeting with Grant at one point, and he says, we have a problem. We owe the Marine Bank $1.3 million.
Wow.
But we'll make it right. And of course, Grant, being the credulous individual that he was, says, okay, Ferdy, so what do you need me to do? So Ferdy says, I need $150,000 for 24 hours, and everything will be fine. So Grant goes to William Vanderbilt, and he and Vanderbilt talk, and Grant says, I'll tell you what we'll do. You give me the check for $150,000. I'll give you a Grant and Ward check for $150,000, and all I want you to do is hold it for 24 hours, and then we'll repay the loan. Well, there's no money in the account. Suddenly, there's a run on the Marine Bank, which then closes its doors. Grant goes to the office. Buck tells him the problem. There is no money to be had. What little money there was, Ward had taken. As a matter of fact, checks that Grant wrote went into Ward's personal account. Ward then makes himself absolutely scarce. What a surprise. And the doors to Grant and Ward are locked. At this point, Ulysses S. Grant is left with $80 in his pocket. And Julia has $130 in her cookie jar.
Huh.
That is the extent of their liquid assets. So Grant is now up against the wall, and he's been approached by various publishers to write down his Civil War experiences. And he gave the same kind of response to everyone who approached him. And that was, it's all in Badeau. He had I guess you would call him a secretary, but he had served on Grant's staff. after the Wilderness and had been with Grant through his administration, accompanied Grant on his tour of the world. And Badeau was a writer, and he had written the story of Ulysses Grant. And I believe the title was Ulysses Grant in War. And it had been published. And so Grant, when people approached him, said, well, you don't need me to write anything. Just read Adam Badeau's book. Well, the financial pinch got worse and worse and worse. And finally he realized he needed to do something to bail himself out. So he's approached by representatives from the Century magazine. And their offer is, we'll pay you $500 an article to write on 4 of the greatest battles you were involved in. They said, we'd like you to do Shiloh, Vicksburg, the Wilderness, and Appomattox. And they were going to pay him the whopping sum of $500 an article. Well, when you're in that kind of financial situation, $500 looks like a lot of money.
Sure.
So he agrees that he'll do it. And he writes his article on Shiloh, and it's a complete bust because he wrote it in a very, very academic, very cold style. So Robert Underwood Johnson, who was the associate editor of the magazine, goes to Grant's house, and he says, can we just talk about the Battle of Shiloh for a minute? And Grant goes on telling these wonderful anecdotes and all this personal stuff and all these colorful things. And Johnson goes, that's what we're looking for, General. Write it that way, as if you're telling a story to someone else. So Grant rewrites the Shiloh article, and he writes it in that style. And he goes on and he writes about Vicksburg, he writes about the Wilderness, but he doesn't write about Appomattox. He replaces that with the story of the Battle of Chattanooga. Well, now the issue comes up. I'm sorry?
Why? Can you explain to us, or do you know the understanding of why he would change it from Appomattox to Chattanooga?
Honestly, I've never been really clear on that.
Okay.
Unless he felt uncomfortable writing about Appomattox. And I think for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I guess in his mind, it would be kind of an in-your-face sort of story to Southern soldiers, Southern veterans. Certainly he had good friends who had fought and commanded armies under the Confederacy. So I think he was a bit reticent to write it initially. And then he also, I think, just the idea that he meets at the McLean House with Robert E. Lee. Lee's dressed in his finest dress uniform, and Grant's in muddy, dusty clothes, and was basically blown off by Lee. He tries to make polite conversation at the McLean House, and he says, I served in Mexico with you, General, and I was with the 4th Infantry. And Lee goes, well, I don't rightly remember you. So it was, Grant was a lieutenant. Lee was a major. They probably had very, very little in common during the Mexican War. And I think that may have been a part of it as well. Although he was one of the most humble men who's ever lived for what he accomplished. But he writes about the Battle of Chattanooga instead. And now the publishing mavens are interested in getting Grant's memoirs, his whole life story. Well, in the meantime, Ulysses Grant is having a little afternoon snack, and he picks up a peach, and he bites into the peach, and suddenly he has this intense pain in his throat. And his first impression is that he might have swallowed a bumblebee.
Oh.
but the pain doesn't go away, and it becomes painful for him to swallow. And I guess like all of us, he didn't want to see a doctor because he didn't want to know what the truth was. And I know we all avoid that. Well, finally it got so bad he had to go, and he had a family physician by the name of Fordyce Barker. And he goes to see Barker, and Barker says, we got a problem here. He says, there's some inflammation in the back of your throat. And you have some swelling. He said, I don't like the way it looks. I want you to go see John Hancock Douglas, who was one of the premier physicians on the East Coast. He goes to Douglas. Douglas examines him. And Grant, being Grant, very forceful, very forthright, asked Douglas, is it cancer? And to Douglas's eternal credit, he knew he couldn't lie to Grant. He had to tell him the truth. But he said it was, quote, serious, epithelial in character, and sometimes capable of being cured. But he doesn't leave it there. Douglas doesn't leave it there. He takes a bit of tissue and sends it off to one of the leading microbiologists in the country, George Schrady. And Schrady analyzes it and says, this is serious. And there's a quote in Ron Cherno's book on Grant that he and Douglas are talking. And Douglas has not told him whose tissue sample this is. And Schrady tells him it's cancer and it's really, really serious. Douglas says, well, the patient is Ulysses Grant. And Schrady's response is, Grant is done for.
Oh, wow.
It's inoperable. Of course, most things were inoperable in those days, but it's clearly terminal.
And Judge, we are up against the time for this segment of our program. So we, unfortunately, but we're going to continue on with the story of Grant in our next program. So we need to leave it right there for now. And we're going to pick up right there with the story in our next program. So Judge, we want to thank you. We want to thank you for beginning the story of Ulysses S. Grant last year of his life with us, and we're going to continue listeners in the next program. So, Judge Lacey, thank you so much for coming on this program and sharing your knowledge with us about Ulysses S. Grant.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is WFYL 1180 AM, working for your liberty.
The Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
When you experience the loss of a loved one, you can trust the Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory to guide you through the arrangements necessary to create a meaningful ceremony that celebrates the unique life being honored. Our staff is committed to providing your family with the highest quality of care and service in your time of need. We take pride in our responsibility to lighten your burden as you take the first step towards healing. Ask us about how we create a unique service for your loved one. Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory also helps with planning ahead so all the details of the service are taken care of. Ask us how we can connect you with grief support networks in your area. Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory has the resources to compassionately guide you through the loss of your loved one.
Contact us at 610-272-1941. That's 610-272-1941. Or visit our website at myersfh.com. That's MEYERSFH.com.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am Art Turner, the host of the program. The American Heritage program is where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning through the present. And today we want to welcome back as our special guest, Judge Thomas Lacey. So Judge, welcome back to the program.
Well, I'm glad to be back.
And thank you for coming and sharing with us. You have a depth of knowledge about a lot of American history, which we appreciate you sharing with our listeners. In our last program, you were talking about the last year of Ulysses S. Grant's life, and you had just gotten to the point where the diagnosis of cancer for Ulysses S. Grant. And so I would like you to pick up the story there. But before we do, Judge, I'm curious about two questions about Ulysses S. Grant. One, his ability that he didn't seem to be too immersed in economics and the financial situation of his life because of what he went through. And if you could address that. And then secondly, could you share with our listeners a little bit of the personality of Ulysses S. Grant? Because what you were describing is oftentimes not the personality that a lot of Americans believe that Ulysses S. Grant was.
Well, I think Grant has taken a lot of abuse based on the people he surrounded himself with, especially during his presidency. He was scrupulously honest, very bullheaded, absolutely. He was once described as having the look that he was going to put his head through a brick wall. And Samuel Clemens once said that when he met Grant, that Grant had the kind of face that looked like it had smiled in several years. And when he met Twain, he smiled a little bit. And then Grant said, but he probably won't do that again for another 7 years. But again, Grant was scrupulously honest. Unfortunately, he was also incredibly trusting. And that had led him to all kinds of problems throughout his life. He lost money when he was in California. He ended up almost penniless before the war. I think the war saved him financially. But again, he gets to the point where he's convinced he's the national hero. And of course, national heroes, especially national hero generals, run for president. Mm-hmm. So in 1868, he succumbs to that, resigns his commission with the Army. He's at that point a 4-star general, full general, which means he's now giving up not only his salary as a general, but also any hope of a pension afterward. And now, as a retired jurist, I'm having a small problem with this, but we didn't pay our politicians and our public office holders pensions in those days. Although I'm very grateful to the taxpayers of the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that I am receiving a pension. But the President of the United States in the 1880s did not receive a pension. So he wasn't very good with money. And I don't think he ever looked down the road. I think he was more the kind of person who says, well, I have some money in my pocket, I'm doing okay. And every time he tried to make money, he found himself maybe even poorer than he was when he started, because he relied on other people who eventually and always cheated him out of it, as we discussed the last time with Ferdinand Ward.
Right.
But he was scrupulously honest. And he was also the kind of person who never turned back. He would keep on moving forward. And I think that's the essence of the story of the last year of his life, moving forward. He once told the story that if he got lost going to a place he had never been and he missed a turnoff, he wouldn't go back to the turnoff. He would find another way to go, but he never wanted to turn around. Like a typical male, never stop and ask directions.
Well, today he probably wouldn't use the GPS then. He would just...
Absolutely not.
What, Judge, was he a popular president?
He was a very popular president. But again, you had a whole group of people who saw him as being corrupt and evil. But I think the people of the United States really loved him. Again, he was the hero of the Civil War. He won the war. And the people in the South eventually came to respect him. But was he a popular president with the politicians? Absolutely not. Matter of fact, Chester Arthur really didn't like him when Arthur became president, courtesy of Garfield's assassination.
And I want you to pick up your story, but I'm going to ask you this question while I'm thinking of it, because of my old age, I forget things rather quickly.
You too?
Yes, me too. Oh, I'm not the only one. Okay. The series this was on recently on the History Channel, one on Ulysses S. Grant. Did you see it? And if you did, what was your opinion of that series on Ulysses S. Grant?
Oh, I saw it, and I liked it a great deal. I think they gave this last year a short shrift, but there was so much to his life. Mm-hmm. even those years in California where he took to the bottle and had to resign in disgrace from the Army, that was a very important part of what created Ulysses Grant, the man that he became. There were anecdotes that were missing that I would have liked to have seen, but on the whole, I rather liked the miniseries very, very well.
Okay, good. I appreciate your view of that because I liked it. I wish they had spent more time in his presidency, but they did. So if you would, please pick up the story that we were talking about in the last show where Ulysses S. Grant has been diagnosed with cancer.
All right. Grant, as we said the last time, had gone to see his family doctor, Fordyce Barker. Barker sent him to a specialist by the name of Douglas. Douglas then sends a tissue sample to George Schrady, who was a real specialist, and Schrady diagnoses it as cancer and diagnoses it as terminal. Grant now, based upon his loss of all his liquid assets through Ferdinand Ward, is now really only being supported by the articles he's writing for Century Magazine. He's been approached by a number of publishing companies, including Century, to write his memoirs. Now suddenly he realizes he has to do something to not only take care of his current expenses, but also to provide for Julia after his death. And I think he was painfully aware that he only had a limited amount of time to accomplish what he could to ensure her comfort after he was gone. So he sits down with the folks from the Century, and they offer him a deal. And the deal is that they will publish his memoirs, and they will do it by what they call subscription. They would send out door-to-door salesmen who would get orders for the book, and when they had gotten enough orders, they would print. They offered him 10% of the net proceeds, but out of that 10%, he had to pay incidental expenses. Well, as luck would have it, as God is smiling on him, a young guy named Samuel Langhorne Clemens
Wow.
is walking down the street in New York, and he tells a story that it's a misty, foggy night, and these two wraith-like individuals appear in front of him, and they are discussing publishing Grant's memoirs. Well, it's kind of true, except that Twain, I'm going to call him Mark Twain from now on, Twain catches up with them. And it's Richard Gilder from the Century. One of the two people is Richard Gilder from the Century Magazine. And Gilder invites him to dinner. And Gilder tells him he has pulled off the greatest publishing coup in the history of publishing. He's going to have Grant's memoirs. Well, what does Twain do? First thing the next morning, he heads to East 66th Street. Now, he had met Grant on a few other occasions. They knew each other. He had been a keynote speaker at an affair reunion of I guess it was a GAR reunion. And he had been the keynote speaker, and he had gotten to know Grant. So he goes there, and his son Fred and Ulysses are sitting, and they're reviewing the contract from the Century. And Grant has Fred read him the contract. Grant still has not signed it. And I can almost see the older Mark Twain sitting there, head back, listening, periodically blowing air through his mustache. And he says, strike the 10% and put in 20%. He goes, better yet, put in 75% of the net. And Greg says, I can't do that. He goes, well, otherwise it's a lousy contract. He says, I'll give you those terms. Well, Grant, he's been burned. He trusts the folks at the Century because so far they've done everything they said they were going to do. They wrote him his $500 check per article on his great battles. So Grant does something that was unusual for him. He actually consults with somebody else. He contacts George Childs, who was a journalist and someone he trusted. And George Childs reviews the contract. Meanwhile, Twain leaves it in the hands of a fellow he refers to as his son-in-law or his nephew-in-law. And they continue the negotiations while Twain goes on a speaking tour for 3 months. And meanwhile, Charles Webster, the nephew-in-law, continues to talk to Grant. He talks to Childs. And by the time Twain gets back, the deal is made. And again, Twain is going to sell the book by subscription. He says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a $50,000 signing bonus. Grant looks at him and says, are you kidding me? He said, look, My good friend, William Tecumseh Sherman, published his memoirs, and he only made $25,000. You're going to give me an advance of $50,000? He goes, no, it's not happening. He said, I'll tell you what, give me $1,000, and that'll seal the deal. And Twain later said, imagine how pathetic it is that this man's willing to take $1,000 just to feed himself.
Yeah. How sad.
So Twain goes forward with it and makes regular appearances at Grant's home. And Grant brings in Adam Beddoe to help really do fact-checking and proofreading and things like that. And Fred's there, and Fred's doing it. Of course, Fred's living with the family because he's broke, and Fred and his family are living there. And the book is coming. Meanwhile, Grant is getting worse and worse and worse. And it's just a question of, will I ever finish this book? There's one point. Now, Julia had gotten rather taken by an evangelical preacher by the name of John Newman. And Newman was kind of her spiritual advisor. And Newman was kind of that. Today, he would have been a TV preacher.
Okay, yeah.
Not so much worried about the flock so much as he was about the shepherd. And he moves in. He actually goes to the Grant home, and he participates in the evening prayers. And as he's doing that, Grant kind of just tolerates him for Julia's sake. And on one occasion, Grant had been unconscious for a period of time. He was having trouble breathing, but Newman thought this is a great opportunity. I'm going to baptize him. He said, but I can't baptize him as long as he's unconscious. Well, Grant finally regains consciousness, and he agrees to be baptized. Well, what does our boy do? He runs right out to the press, who have been camped out across the street from Grant's house on a death watch, and tells them that God has General Grant available for some great thing, and I was the guy who brought him back to the Lord. There's no indication Grant ever left the Lord.
Yeah.
But Newman takes credit for bringing the general back into the bosom of the Lord. Okay. But Grant at that point, and you can see how terrible things are becoming. Schrady and Douglas give him an injection of brandy. We've come a long way in medical science. It has no effect. They give him another injection. He begins to cough up blood, which opens his airways, and he's back on track again. He continues to write the book. In the meantime, his very old and very dear friend, William Tecumseh Sherman, decides he has to do something for Grant. And the very least he can do is get Grant reinstated on the list of general officers and get him his pension. Anything to help him out financially.
Yeah.
So Sherman goes to Congress, and he starts lobbying to get Grant his military pension. Well, the first time he tries it, they table it. He tries again a couple of weeks later. It is shot down primarily by Southern congressmen, which I think is kind of ironic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's a great quote. Let me get that for you. The New York Times wrote about the failure of the legislation. And it said 4 Confederate brigadiers, 11 colonels, 1 lieutenant colonel, 1 major, 5 captains, 2 lieutenants, and 12 enlisted men did to Grant in Congress what they couldn't do in the field.
Wow.
Well, the time is growing short. We're now into 1885, and Grover Cleveland is about to take office. It's March the 4th of 1885. Grover Cleveland's about to take office as President of the United States. It's tradition, even today, that Congress adjourns or recesses at the moment of the inauguration. Well, now we're down to the 11th hour. If anything's going to happen, it's going to happen now. The House, the morning of March the 4th, which in those days was Inauguration Day, passes the bill. It now has to go to the Senate. Well, the Senate's all getting ready for Cleveland's inauguration. So they're all heralded back into the Senate chamber. Well, they can't take any action after noon on Inauguration Day. So the clerk to the Senate turns the clock back 20 minutes. And they vote on the bill, and it passes. They then run it to Chester Arthur, who is still technically the President of the United States, because it's not noon yet, according to the Senate's clock. And he signs the bill into law. And Grant is reinstated. The following day, Grover Cleveland places him on the active list. So he's now going to receive a pension, which will then translate to Julia, which I think probably eased his mind a great deal.
Sure.
But he finally finishes the memoirs. In the meantime, Adam Beddoe, I think, probably knew he was going to be eclipsed by Grant's book. His book was going to be put on some dusty shelf somewhere, and nobody was ever going to open it again. So he comes to Grant with an ultimatum. Now, Grant had agreed to pay him $5,000 for the first 20,000 volumes and $5,000 for the next 10, just for his services as basically a proofreader and a fact checker. He comes to Grant and says he wants $1,000 a month to stay there and continue doing what he's doing. And then he wants 10% of the profits.
Wow.
Well, Grant sounds like another president we know, and he turns to him and goes, "You're fired." But he couldn't be venal. So he says he writes Beddoe a note and says, "Well, you're always welcome here whenever you want to come by." And Beddoe leaks a story to the press that he's the actual author. And Grant says, "Everybody knows I'm writing the book." Twain, of course, being Twain, says, "Oh, no, we're going to sue him." Grant goes, "Just knock it off. Don't worry about it." Well, things are getting bad. It's coming into the summer of 1885. And Grant's doctors decide it's probably unhealthy for him to stay in the city. And they go looking for some kind of salubrious environment for him. And they find a place near Mount McGregor, New York, up near Saratoga. And there's a cottage there, and it's owned by Joseph Drexel of the Philadelphia Drexels, a wealthy man. And Drexel offers him the cottage at no cost. Now, there are some who say that Drexel was not nearly as eleemosynary as it seems, because he also owned a part of the Balmoral Hotel, which was next door to the cottage. And a lot of people, myself included, suspect that Drexel felt that there was money to be made selling the place where Grant died, or drawing tourists to the place where Grant died. Be that as it may, Grant moves to Mount McGregor and on a train provided by William Vanderbilt. I mean, if you just look at the who's who of that year.
Wow, yeah.
And he goes up there and he has people watching out for him. He's got Douglas and Schrady with him. He has Harrison Terrell, who was his valet, who takes care of him. Fred's there. And he continues to write. And Julia at one point says, "My husband is writing for bread." It should have been somewhere in Gone with the Wind, I think, that line. But,
Sure.
And while he's there, well, first of all, let me just kind of back up a bit. While he's talking to Twain about the contract on his memoirs, a visitor shows up at the house on East 66th Street. Fellow had just written a book not too long before, a guy by the name of Lew Wallace.
Wow.
And Wallace had just published Ben-Hur, which I discovered, and I didn't know it until I started doing the research on Grant, that Wallace bumped Harriet Beecher Stowe as the number one author in terms of sales. I thought that was fascinating. Of course, he still didn't make it to the Bible, but he beat out Harriet Beecher Stowe. And then who shows up? And now we're into July. Things are getting terrible. Grant has been reduced to where he can no longer speak. He's writing everything in pencil. And that's how he's communicating. And an old acquaintance arrives, and that's Simon Bolivar Buckner. And Buckner is on his way home from his honeymoon with his new wife, who was, I believe, 27 years old. You know, he and Longstreet are just, I'm envious of both of them, but because they both married much, much younger women. Please don't tell my wife.
Okay.
But here's the man who Grant offered the terms at Fort Donelson that gave him his nickname, Unconditional Surrender. And Buckner felt the need to stop in and say hi. And Grant sees him and writes down in pencil, "You've gotten a lot grayer and you put on some weight." But Buckner shows up. Robert E. Lee's son writes a letter. Alfred Sidney Johnson's son writes a letter. And he continues to write, and he pushes himself, and he pushes himself. And at one point, he actually says that he's grateful that he's in so much pain because he can't sleep. And since he can't sleep, he can write. And he knows he's under a deadline, literally a deadline.
Yeah.
And he completes the book on July 20th of 1885. And he dies on July 23rd. Truly remarkable story. And of course, the last line in the book is, "Let us have peace."
Wow. And Judge, we're fastly running out of time here with this story. How did the book do in sales?
I was going to get to that. Julia received royalties equal to $450,000. And the rumor is that Twain made $200,000. The book did very, very well. I have, believe it or not, I have the 2-volume set. It was bequeathed to me by my father-in-law.
Yeah.
And I've started to read that now. I mean, the first sentence in the book, "My family have been Americans since the beginning, both directly and collaterally." You want to say you want to start at the beginning? That'll start you at the beginning. But I'm just overwhelmed with respect for what I've discovered of Ulysses Grant.
Yes, absolutely. These are fascinating stories, and both shows here, you're giving us information that very few people know about President General Ulysses S. Grant. So we want to thank you, Judge, for sharing this fascinating story of the last year of Ulysses S. Grant's life.
If I may say one more thing.
Please do.
Please. My wife and I are going to try and get up to the cottage this fall, and I hear you've been there, so I'm jealous.
I have been there, yes, many times. Yes, it actually, some of the wreath for his casket and funeral is still there. The bed that he actually died in is actually still the same bed. It looks like the time has stopped when you go and visit.
Well, I heard that Fred had stopped the clock at 8:08 a.m.
Yes, that is correct. So, Judge, we want to thank you for sharing these two shows about Ulysses S. Grant's last year of his life with us. And would you be willing to come back in later shows and talk more about either the presidency or the military career of Ulysses S. Grant?
Oh, absolutely. I feel much better when I talk about the military career, but I'll be more than happy to come back.
Well, we want to thank you for wanting to do that. We certainly will look with great anticipation of you sharing with us about the military career of Ulysses S. Grant. So thank you for coming, Judge, and sharing these two shows about Ulysses S. Grant's last year of life with us.
And Arch, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is 1180 AM WFYL, working for your liberty.